Well, speaking of missions, we're all aware of what's going on up the interstate, the freeway, I-29 in Hillsboro, North Dakota. And a brand new church being birthed up there actually just started last month. And it's called Harvest Baptist Church. And we're so excited about that because the pastor of it is a graduate of Masters Baptist College, Pastor Justin Jorpeland. And anyway, he has, for the Sunday school hour, about a 4.5-minute video, if you want to come at this time, brother, and introduce it to us. He's going to tell you a little bit about the new work through the video, and then he's going to bring a message. And then remember, tonight at 6 p.m., he'll be bringing the message for our evening service as well. Brother Jorpeland.
Thank you, Pastor. It was definitely a blessing to be back here. Spent a lot of years here, and it was always exciting to me to look at Missions Month and think about spending a whole month just really concentrated on missions, but it's definitely different being on this side of everything. So, but we're excited to be here. And so we've got a video that we'll play. This particular meeting was scheduled about a year ago, and so you guys are actually on the very end of all of our deputation trails, and so there's going to be some information in it that will help you to understand where some things are at, but I got to be upfront with you. We used a video clip in there that shows a picture of a stoplight, and there's not a stoplight in Hillsboro. So I just want you to understand that's the caliber of town that we're looking at. So if we can at this time, we'll go ahead and watch that video.
Hi, my name is Judah, and my report today is on Hillsboro, North Dakota. The population is 1,649. It was settled in 1870. It is an agricultural town located in the Red River Valley. My favorite thing about it is all the bald eagles there you can find.
Hillsboro is a quiet little town in North Dakota, a community with a rich agricultural history. You'll regularly see tractors drive through, folks on golf carts, and everywhere you look, you'll see that iconic farmer wave.
Hi, my name's Justin, and with my wife Hannah and our two little boys, Judah and Theodore, we are church planters to Hillsboro, North Dakota. I've worked in youth ministries for the last 8 years in churches in North Dakota and Iowa. In the year 2020, God began to work in my heart to burden me towards church planting, and we began to pray about a location of where He would have us to go. As we prayed about that, it became very, very clear that God wanted us to go to the farming communities. I grew up in central Iowa, surrounded by corn and tractors, so it came as no surprise to me that God had burdened us for those that live in and around the farming communities. In the summer of 2022, the Lord began to open the doors for us to move to northern Minnesota to work with Bible Baptist Church and Pastor Preston Hoyseth. Bible Baptist was burdened to see a church planted in Hillsboro, but there was no man to go. Little did any of us know that God had already set things in motions for that, and by His grace, we will be starting a church there in early 2024.
Though the town is rich in agriculture, it is poor in truth. In this small town, there are 3 bars and a large brewery that's planning expansions. There's also several Lutheran and Catholic churches and a United Parish church. The people of Hillsboro are searching for something to fill a void in their hearts. As the Trail County seat, Hillsboro reaches the entire population of 8,000 people. There is currently no Baptist church of any kind in the county or in either of the counties to the east and west of it.
Our goal is to establish a New Testament Baptist church in this community, a church that will speak the truth in love and show the people in this town who has been missing in their lives. As we strive to introduce the people of Hillsboro to Jesus Christ, will you pray about partnering with us?
How can we reach a world we never touch? How can we show them Christ if we never show them love? Just to say we care will never be enough. a world we never touch. We hide behind these walls in the security of friends, but beyond the stained glass window, a world is lost in sin. How can we reach a world we never touch? How can we show them Christ if we never show them love? Just to say we care will never be enough. How can we reach a world we never touch? How can we reach a world we never touch?
So a few things have changed since that video. The first one being we have 3 little boys now. And so we've got Judah, which some of you have already met. He was born in 2018 or 2016. And when we left in 2018, many of you knew who he was. Well, since then we have added Theodore and Ezekiel. And they're both over in the other wing in Sunday school this morning. And so we've been very excited about how God has continued to provide and open doors as we've looked at the church plant in Hillsboro. Since we moved up there, we started a Bible study, and we maintained that Bible study for about a year. And then in December, we started having midweek Bible studies as we tried to build some steam looking towards March and getting things off the ground. And then March 10th, we started with our very first service. And I tell you what, I've never felt more nervous and excited and sick to my stomach in my life. It was just a whirlwind of emotions that day, just to know where God had brought me from and where he had brought me to. It was exciting to be part of that and watch as God moved. So that we had 2 soft opening services as we tried to practice, maybe we'd call it practice church, so that I could figure out how to run some things, and so that I gave our sound guy and our music guy some opportunity to figure some things out. We were very blessed to actually have, I know Pastor Skeving has mentioned it several times, that he has a granddaughter that is up in Hillsboro. I didn't know if you guys knew that or not, but he has a granddaughter up there. And so the Huffman family came alongside us and helped us. And then some of you would remember Doug DeKreider, who came to Bible college here. He was here for a couple of years with me, and he and his family actually moved up in January to help us with the music program. Actually, right before we moved from here to go back down to Iowa, I broke a piece of cartilage in my throat and damaged some vocal cords. And so I already didn't sing great. And so now I really don't sing great, and so it was a blessing to have Doug come up and help us with that. He's been a great blessing to me. So our grand opening service, we had 57 in attendance. I never panicked more in my life, I think, when I went and sat down, and I'm typically a person who's here very early. I arrive early to church, I'm prepared, I'm there ahead of time. I'm putting my microphone on, I go sit down in the front row, and there's not actually that many people that are there yet. And it's about 10:27, and I sit in my row and I look at my notes real quick as I'm waiting for the service to start. And then I get up to open the service in prayer, and the room is packed, and we're running out of chairs. And you know, that's a huge blessing, a huge opportunity to see as God has moved and people have come. And I'm really glad for all of you that have been praying for it. It's been a very exciting time to see the doors that he has been opening and the people that he has brought in this region. That it seemed like there was churches in, Larimore and Grand Forks and Crookston and Valley City and Fargo and Jamestown, and it was like there was this band through the middle, that there wasn't anything out there. As I said in the video, God really burdened me for small towns. I grew up in a town of 500 people. And so I think about, I wish there was somebody that was there that would have reached me. I didn't get saved until I was 22 years old. I was actually standing in the back section back here one night and just completely broken, knowing that I needed to get saved. And I really wish that somebody had reached me when I was younger, and I want to be that for somebody else. I want to go to these farming communities and go out and reach these farmers and tell them about the one person that could change their entire life. So as I thought about what we were going to do this morning when we started thinking about preaching and the lesson, maybe I also felt like Pastor Skeving set me up, and he said, we're going to have Justin kick things off for Missions Month, so if I flop, it just ruins the whole Missions Month, so please don't have that in your mind. But as we got to this point of making some preparations, I really thought about, Lord, what do you want me to talk about? And so as I thought about it, I want to talk to you, I guess this morning, about something that is my burden for Hillsboro, but for me personally, what my goal is for being there. So I'm actually going to have you take your Bible and turn to two different places. If you would turn to 1 Corinthians and Colossians chapter number 4. 1 Corinthians would be chapter number 4, and Colossians will be chapter number 4, please. So I just want to read a couple of verses to you here in 1 Corinthians. We'll start there, but hold your place in Colossians. 1 Corinthians chapter number 4, God's word tells us, "Let a man so account of us as of the ministers of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful." You know, thousands of years ago, they started to use headstones for grave markers, that they would have things written on them, give your birth date and your death date. Many people I've heard say, God knows your birth, you know your birth, God knows your death, and it's just that hyphen in the middle that you have control over of what takes place during that period of time. But the other thing that always attracts people sometimes to look at gravestones is the creative things that are written on them. Some of them are absolutely hilarious, some of them are very truthful of that person. And when I think about my life, I would really hope to get to that point where I could be found faithful, where I could have lived my life in a way that I was faithful to what God has asked me to do. But as I think about some, I just can't help but give you a couple of hilarious grave markers that are there. There's a couple that I have listed. One of my favorites is Mel Blanc, the voice of Bugs Bunny, and that's all, folks. And I always crack up at that one. Or Jesse James. His says, "Murdered by a traitor and a coward whose name is not worthy to appear here." Or Rodney Dangerfield. His says, "There goes the neighborhood." And Merv Griffin, this is probably one of my favorites. It says, "I will not be right back after this message." When we think about those things, we think about, maybe the brevity of life. And the things of these are just small statements that describes a lifetime that somebody had lived. And I just wonder, what would yours stay? What would be described of you? What would be told of your life? Whatever length of time that is, how will you be described? What would your epitaph say? Maybe have this thought. Would it say, "Found faithful" or "Found faithless"? And that's the thought that I want to project to you guys this morning. So let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I want to thank you so much for the opportunity you've given us to be here today. Lord, as we've lifted your name in praise, Lord, I pray that you would continue to meet with us. Lord, that you would help us all. Lord, that we would draw closer to you, that you would help us in this area of faithfulness. Lord, that our walk with you might be closer today than it was yesterday. And we'll pray all these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen. So this last year when I was up in Crookston, we spent some time up in Crookston after I had left Iowa. I did some additional training under Pastor Hoyseth, going through some different things that would help me as I became from a youth pastor to a full-time pastor. And so we went through some things, and one of the things that he had me do is take the opportunity to preach through a book of the Bible. So last January we started and I went through the entire book of Colossians. And so many preachers will often say this, that, this book that I'm preaching through, it's such a good book. It's my favorite book because it's the one I'm preaching through right now. And so I found that so true. I really enjoyed going through Colossians. I've always had a love for the writings of Paul. I just really enjoy reading through the things that he has experienced and the direction that God allowed him to give to us. But as I looked at Colossians, I always struggle when I get to the end of a book, because it's like saying goodbye, it's closing it off, it's ending things out, and so I struggled with that. But Colossians was a little bit different for me, because as we find the end of Colossians, if you turn over there with me, there's a list of names that are given through this section. And it really caused me to think where I started off with these epitaphs and the thoughts of, we don't have a whole lot that we know about many of these people. When I first got here to Bible college in 2012, Pastor Skeving was taking some time to go through, and he's preaching this series on God's nobodies. And that was a fascinating series to me. I was unsaved at the time, but it was still fascinating to listen and go through as he's talking about these people that there's not even names listed for some of these people. But then some of them, it's like we just have a couple of details or a little bit of details, and that's where I found these guys. This list of people that we just have a few details about each and every one of them, but they really challenge us in our faithfulness. Where are we in our faithfulness? The first one that we would look at is chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. It says, "All my state shall Tychicus declare unto you, who is a beloved brother and a faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord, whom I have sent unto you for the same purpose, that he might know your estate and comfort your hearts." So Tychicus, this first guy that we hear about, there's only 5 mentions of him in all of Scripture. That's all the details that we have about this guy's life. And I think about that with our own lives. How much detail do we get? How much things are we left with that will tell of our life? Are you going to have, books written about you? Chapters written? Are there going to be a few sentences? Or maybe just, a few retorts or remarks about your life? That's all we have for Tychicus, is just these few things. The first time that we'll actually see him mentioned is Acts chapter 20. I'll read the verse for you. It's verse number 4. "And there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia Tychicus and Trophimus." And as I said, I don't know a whole lot about him. We know that he's listed here as some of the companions of Paul. He was along with Paul on his missionary journeys. And we can draw some conjecture from that. We could say, well, he probably was a faithful servant. He was probably somebody who was very faithful to what Paul was doing, because Paul's not going to mess around. Paul has this consuming thing in his life that he is going through, and he's trying to reach every single person that he possibly can. He's not going to have somebody with him that is not going to be on that same page. And so I look at Tychicus, and I'm like, man, this guy had to be, he wanted to help. He wanted to serve. He wanted to follow what the Lord was going to have for him to do. Where did he join Paul along the way? I don't know. We don't have that information. We don't have that thought, but, I just wonder, maybe Paul was probably the one that led him to the Lord. Maybe he is a product of Paul's ministry. He calls him a beloved brother. We often, in Baptist circles, there's one thing that I've enjoyed as I've gone out and met people at churches and then ran into them along the road down the way, and I'm not great with names. And so then I get the pleasure of, "Brother, how are you doing?" Because I don't remember what your name is, so I'm sorry. But, "Brother, how are you doing?" We call people brothers or sisters, but that's not what Paul said. Paul said, "Beloved brother." There was a spot in Paul's heart for Tychicus, a space that this guy was near and dear to Paul's heart. It was somebody that he had this close relationship, and I can't help but think about the people that I've had the opportunity to lead to the Lord. I think about the years that I spent working in youth ministry and the teenage lives that I got to lead to the Lord, and their life is near and dear to me. They're following the Lord, and it's a blessing to see what God is doing in their life. And I think that's where we find Tychicus. I think that's the relationship that he has there with Paul. But he also says that he is a faithful minister and a fellow servant. I think about that, as I said, as he goes along and he's spending time with Paul on this missionary journey. He's not just there. He's doing things. He's helping out. He's ministering where he can minister. He's doing everything that he possibly can to be a help and an encouragement. We know the life that Paul went through, the difficulties that he had in ministry, the hardships that took place, and this guy's right along there with him. It's like getting a list of requirements for, we're going to do this and this and this and this, and you don't show it to anybody, because if they did see it, they would never come along. They would never want to participate in that. Yet we find Tychicus there. We find him there and faithful. 2 Timothy 4:12 says, "And Tychicus have I sent to Ephesus." As I said, getting to the end of books is always a sad part. Well, I think about the book of 2 Timothy. Paul is one of my favorite writers, and I hate every year as I'm going through my yearly Bible reading and I get to 2 Timothy, because it's the end. It's the last thing that we hear from Paul on this side of eternity. And I'm like, I don't want it to be over yet. I don't want it to be done yet. But as we think of some of the remarks that are made within that book, he says, "And Tychicus have I sent to Ephesus." Tychicus was there at the end. He had been faithful for whatever, we don't know the time frame that he was there, but he was faithful that period of time. He was following Paul as Paul was serving the Lord. And he was there up until the end. And when I think about maybe that beloved brother aspect, I think he got to a point where he said, "Tychicus, you have to go. Things are getting hard. Things are getting tough. God probably has something else for you. I need you to go. I need you to leave me to go help somewhere else." And that was probably a difficult time for him. It was a hard time. But Paul was in danger. Paul was in a troubled period of life that he didn't want Tychicus to have to fall into that. But he gives more instruction to him. In the verses that we read, he said, "All my state shall Tychicus declare unto you." He had things that he would send Tychicus on to do. And I find this one very interesting when we look at his life, that he sends him with the letter to the Colossians, to the church at Colossae. Now, we might think about it today, and there's letters all over the place. I get so many letters in the mail that are just junk letters and things that I don't care about. I wonder if Tychicus had any idea that the letter that he was carrying would outlive him, would outlive the Roman Empire, would outlive everybody that was there. Thousands of years later, the church at Colossae is gone, and we still have this letter. I wonder if he knew what he was carrying, if he had any idea what was going on, because this letter is still changing lives today. This letter is still speaking to people today. And I just can't help but think about the faithfulness that he trusted him to take this letter. "Tychicus, I need you to take this letter to Colossae. I need you to take this, and I can trust you that you're going to deliver it." And I think about our own lives. Is there things that God can trust you with? Is there things that God has asked you to do because he knows you're faithful enough to do it? Because I think there's many Christians that God didn't ask to do things because he knew he couldn't trust them. He knew that they weren't choosing to be faithful. They weren't choosing to follow after God. How's your faithfulness? We're going to give an abrupt start to missions conference, but I just wonder, where's your faithfulness at? Can God trust you with things? You're going to spend a month here hearing from missionaries from probably all over the country, all over the world, and maybe God would lay something on your heart. Can he trust you to do it? That you will be faithful enough to listen as he leads? Because that's what we're called to do. We are called to have a faithful life, even if it's hard, even if it's difficult. Because the next guy on the list had a difficult task. This is one of my favorite stories I can't say that, the whole Bible's my favorite. This is another one of my favorite stories, but verse number 9 of chapter number 4, it tells us, "With Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you, they shall make known unto you all things which are done here." Onesimus is one of my favorite stories in Scripture because I think about my own life and the change that took place. I said that I was here in 2012. I followed my wife Hannah here. I was unsaved. I had lived a really rough life. I had gotten a lot of trouble. I had followed my own desires through life. And I look at what God did in Onesimus' life. A runaway slave had left his master and had gotten saved somewhere along the road. And now God's using him. And now God's sending him places with another letter that we still have today. He sends him with the letter of Philemon. Philemon 1 gives us the description of that. "I beseech thee for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my bonds, which in time past was to thee unprofitable, but now profitable to thee and to me, whom I have sent again. Thou therefore receive him. This is mine own bowels, whom I would have retained with me, that in thy stead he might have ministered unto me in the bonds of the gospel. But without thy mind would I do nothing, that thy benefit should not be, as it were, of necessity, but willingly." The story of Onesimus is he's a runaway slave. He left his master. He just decided to get out of there. At some point in time, he comes into contact with Paul, and Paul leads him to the Lord. Maybe we'd say another beloved brother. He leads him to the Lord, and what a glorious thing to see people saved. I often think that God brings people into certain environments so that he can work on their heart a little bit better. Now, I'm not saying that God had Onesimus run away from his master, but it is that period of time that he got saved. And it's exciting. He's helping out Paul, but Paul says, you've got to do the right thing, regardless of what the outcome could be. You know, this is a different type of faithfulness than Tychicus. You've got to do what's right no matter what could happen, no matter what could take place. Because the day that they lived in, if a slave had run away and then returned to the master would do whatever he could to, as brutally as possible, murder that slave in front of the other slaves so that he would set that precedent. Don't mess with me. Don't you dare run away. Don't you dare do something wrong, because this is what awaits you. And Onesimus no doubt had that thought in his mind. What if this happens? What if I go back and I'm murdered because I did something wrong? Philemon's a Christian. He says that he's a fellow brother. But he still had that thought in his mind. What is going to take place? And I just can't help but, I think of modern day letters, and he's just walking with this letter, and what's going to take place? What's going to happen? God told me to go, regardless of what could take place. And so I'm going to go. And so I'm going to follow after. And I think about my life, and I think about the blessing that I had, that I went back to my home church for 4 years, and I got to work as the youth pastor there, and what a blessing that was. There was a time that it was very tumultuous in my life, that I was thinking about what God was going to have me do as he started to lead me towards being a pastor, towards planting a church. And I questioned, Lord, are you sure? Are you sure this is what you want me to do? Are you sure this is the path that you want me to go down? Because I'm not sure. It might not work out. It might not come to anything. And God said, go. Thankfully, thus far, I have tried to be obedient to that. But when I said, this is the goal of my heart, I want to be found faithful in whatever it is that God would have me to do. Whether it's a situation where I have all of these outcomes that could be negative things that I could be thinking about, like Onesimus, what if this happens, and what if this happens? Well, I hate to break it to you, but that's most of the Christian life. Most of the Christian life is God putting you in situations that you don't feel comfortable in, because it demonstrates his strength. It demonstrates him leading you and him being the one to do things. He just wants you to be humble and faithful and follow him as he leads you. And I feel like that's what Onesimus was. That's this guy that we don't have a ton of information on, yet we know he was faithful. That was one of his traits. He was a faithful person that went back to his master as God had told him to do. He wanted to do the right thing. Now, I also think about that with people who maybe have recently gotten saved. People who maybe, like myself, lived kind of a rough background before they got saved. There's things in life that even after we get saved, people think, it's a clean slate, I'm good to go, which it is in some ways. And in others, it's an opportunity for you to make things right. Things that were wrong, things that you had done wrong. We look at it like, what could happen to me? What trouble could I get in? What legal things could happen if something that extensive had happened? How big and negative could this thing possibly be? It doesn't matter, because it testifies to your God that getting right is more important than the consequences. Being right with your God, being right with other people is more important. So again, regardless of outcome. If we had a generation of Christians that were willing to faithfully walk after God, regardless of what the outcome could be, regardless of what they think could happen, what great things God could do through them. I think of the disciples who turned the world upside down because they were willing to follow in faithfulness, regardless of outcome. The next person that we can look at is Aristarchus in verse number 10. It says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and Marcus, sister's son, to Barnabas, touching whom ye received commandments, if he come unto you, receive him. Aristarchus, it specifically mentions that he is a fellow prisoner with Paul, which we might think is maybe an interesting statement as we look through there. Well, he is mentioned in that same verse that Tychicus is mentioned in Acts 20. And there accompanied him into Asia, Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus. Paul gives us so much detail about this guy that we have the details of fellow prisoner and fellow laborer. He was right there in the trenches with Paul as he went along, following what God would have them to do, reaching the people that he would have them to reach. You know, I think that he was there as Paul was dealing with Demetrius, the silversmith. As Paul traveled through Ephesus to Greece, this guy was with him. This guy was following as God was leading them through ministry, the difficult times, the hardships that took place, and the faithfulness of this guy to be there through it all. Because how many times have we heard the statement or the phrase that's made, when the going gets tough, the tough get going? Well, that may be accurate, but the statement could be just as well said, when the going gets tough, the weak disappear. The faithless walk away. Be faithful. Because this guy, he followed Paul all the way to go be in Rome with him. Acts 27:2 says, and entering into a ship of Adamantium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coasts of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. When we think about the shipwreck that took place with Paul, and we think about the Roman soldiers that had Paul handcuffed and were escorting him to Rome, Aristarchus was there with him. This fellow prisoner. I don't know what he did. I don't know what extent he went to, but we know Paul's arrested for all the things that Paul has done and taking him to Rome. Aristarchus had done something that had gotten him into that same boat. And I wonder if it wasn't just so he could be there with Paul, so that he could be an encouragement to Paul. You know, it's very obvious to tell. Paul's in for a long road. Paul's in for a hardship as he heads towards Rome, as he heads towards the end of his earthly ministry. Aristarchus is there with him. You know, they say that history would tell us that Aristarchus was martyred by Nero. Now, I don't know when that took place, but you know, his faithfulness makes me think of faithfulness to the end. Not faithfulness to a point, not faithfulness to an achievement, not faithfulness to this is as far as I'm willing to go, but faithfulness from the start to the end, wherever that is. Maybe you've got a salvation date. I got saved this date. You have the first part of the headstone. Don't say, I'm going to be faithful for a while. I'm going to be faithful till this happens. I'm going to be faithful till this takes place. No, I'm going to be faithful until this unknown date off in the distance when God takes me home. I will be faithful until the end. Because, you know, Christianity, Baptist churches across our nation, there are people that are walking away, have been faithful people for years and have decided, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to listen anymore. I'm not going to follow anymore. I've got my own things that I want to do. Faithful to the end, just like Aristarchus. I hope we could all fall into that category. I hope we could all be faithful until the very end. The next person on our list is Marcus. He's also mentioned in verse number 10. It says, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas. Many of us will recognize this as John Mark. So John Mark was famous for going on this missionary trip with Paul and Barnabas and leaving and quitting right in the middle. Before they really got to the work, he said, I can't handle this. I can't do this. And, you know, I think he's in this list for a reason. Because many people look at something like that and they think, man, that's going to haunt this guy for his life. He's going to have this thing over his head that you quit. You were a quitter. You were unfaithful. You didn't follow like you were supposed to. But you know what's nice about that? You still have the opportunity to become faithful. If you sit here today and you're still breathing, you have a chance to become faithful if you haven't been. If you had a life like John Mark, if you did something in some way that has just been this big, huge mistake, you can still get it right. You serve a God who's willing to forgive you, who's willing to still use you. As I mentioned several times, I lived a rough life. I was one of those people that people didn't want to really talk to. I was a drunk. I was an alcoholic. I was not the person that you would just like, I'm going to go talk to that guy about Jesus. And guess what? Through God's grace, he brought me to the end of me and said, I'm still willing to use you. Even as I went into youth ministry, I thought about all this baggage that I carried, all these negative things that I had. Well, I went back to my home church, and during the time that I had been gone, the youth group has transitioned from like 100%, if we could put it this way, church kids to 97% bus kids. And you know what was a blessing? I got to encourage them through things that had actually taken place in my own life, things that they were going through that I got to help them. Don't think that because maybe you've gone through a season of unfaithfulness that God's done with you. You always have the chance to become faithful. But you have to become faithful. You have to put feet to your prayers. You have to put effort into it. God is still willing to use every single one of us. He has plans for your life. Where will your faithfulness be at? The next one we look at is verse number 11. It talks about a guy named Justus. And it says, and Jesus, which is called Justus, who are of the circumcision, these only are my fellow workers unto the kingdom of God, which have been a comfort unto me. If you've spent any period of time looking through the Pauline epistles, you will find that there was this subject of Judaizers that followed everywhere that Paul went. It seemed like everywhere, it seemed like they were popping up and causing problems and causing difficulties, trying to live this hybrid Jewish Christian life. And so they were always trying to correct people. And I look at this list and I wonder, God, why did he mention this guy? Why did he talk about these are only his fellow workers? And I can't help but maybe relate it to this. I think that he brought it up for two reasons. One, it was because that particular guy was of the circumcision. He was a Jew, and the people that he was writing to were not Jewish people. And so he's kind of lifting him up a little bit to the extent of, I've proven this guy. This guy has proven himself faithful. He's been following God. He's been serving. You can trust him. And I think that probably the same thing about the other guys. These guys have been working with me. These guys have been faithful. These guys have proven themselves, and you can trust them. You know, I spent the last year being out on deputation at different points in time, and I've gone into churches that sometimes I knew the pastor, and sometimes I didn't know the pastor. And, you know, I could get behind that pulpit and I could say, my name's Justin, and I'm going to Hillsboro, North Dakota. And people will be, who are you? Who's this guy? We have no clue who you are. You know, we have no clue where you're from, all these details. You know, I've had a blessed opportunity that, just like many church planters that have been sent out under good pastors, I could stand in the pulpit and I say, you know, my name's Justin. I'm set out of Bible Baptist Church in Crookston, Minnesota. My pastor is Preston Hoyseth. And because of the faithfulness of my pastor and the faithfulness of that ministry, it gives me a foot to stand on. It gives me some testament of faithfulness, not trying to tout on myself and saying, Justin's faithful. That's not what I'm trying to say, but I'm saying Paul was trying to do that for these guys. He was trying to say, you can trust these guys, because as in a world that was continually going through and all this negative doctrine and false direction was taking place, they had to know where to look. And I think about that in our own world. There's false doctrine everywhere. There's people that are trying to be led astray everywhere by false teachers. So then I ask, where are we supposed to look? Where can we look? Who can we get help from? You know, our pastors can be a huge guide to that and helping us and leading us. And I think that's what was taking place with this guy, Justus. He was saying, you can trust these guys. You can follow after these guys. We come then into Epaphras in verses 12 and 13. And Epaphras was really the whole reason that the book of Colossians was written. He was burdened for the people at Colossae. His heart was consumed with these people. He wanted to help them. He wanted to see them follow God. I'll read the couple verses to you. It says, Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ, saluteth you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers, that ye may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. For I bear him record that he hath great zeal for you, and them that are in Laodicea, and them in Hierapolis. The big thing that catches my attention in that set of verses, laboring fervently for you in prayers. I think one of the greatest downfalls of modern Christianity is the neglect of prayer, the neglect of time spent before God's throne, talking to him, interceding for others, lifting people's requests up to him, trying to go to the Father because you have a request, because you have something that you want him to answer. And that's not who Epaphras was. Epaphras was the guy that he said, man, he's down on his knees, he's praying, he's interceding, fervently praying. And that was kind of convicting to my heart. Can I say that I had a time in my life that I can look back to and say, praise the Lord, I was fervent in prayer right there. What about you? You have times that you could look at and say, man, I was faithful to prayer. I was fervent in prayer because God has called us to do it. Pray without ceasing. God wants us to be talking to him. He doesn't want us just to open up our Bible and hear from him and listen to him and then not talk to him. That's not how a relationship works. Epaphras was faithful to his walk with God. Are you? How's your walk been going this week? Everybody keeps mentioning, we're in missions month. Did you spend time praying for it? Did you spend time preparing your heart for what God was going to do through prayer? Because you're called to be faithful in that way. The last one is actually two guys. Verse 14, it says, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. When I think about this, I'm like, man, Luke does not need much explanation. We know Luke, the beloved physician. He wrote the Gospel of Luke. He wrote Acts. He has all this detail in all of his writing, and you almost feel like you know him. You almost feel like, man, Luke, he wrote all this, and I just enjoy reading it, and it's just a great thing. And he's making this comparison at the end of Paul's life. Again, in 2 Timothy 4:11, it says, only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry. Now, Luke is there with him at the end. I made the comparison about him sending Tychicus away. I need you to go. Why, I wonder if Luke wasn't so close with Paul that Paul said, I need you to go. And Luke was like, nope, not a chance. I will be here with you until the absolute end, until I physically cannot be here any longer. And I want you to take that thought and compare it to the other name that's listed there, Demas. Because just a couple verses before, he tells us that only Luke is with him. He says, do thy diligence to come shortly unto me, for Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica. Demas was the definition of found faithless. He did not follow when things got hard. He chose to walk his own path. He chose to do his own thing because having loved this present world, he wanted to follow after the things that were his desires. I want to do my thing. I want to follow after my desires. I want to do the things that I want to do. I have achievements in life, and I have things that I want to do, and God's not letting me do that. And that just sounds like a crybaby to me of poor me. God has called you to do greater things than those. But maybe you haven't gotten to that point yet. Maybe you haven't gotten to the point where God can use you to do those things because you're loving the present world. I said Christians are walking away from churches all over the nation because I want to do my own thing. Demas loved the present world, and he forsook Paul, and he forsook the ministry, and he walked away from God. Don't be a Demas. God has great things to do through you, but it requires your faithfulness. It requires you to be willing to follow after him. So I'm going to leave you with this last thought. If we started writing right now, by some miracle of God, he said, Justin, I want you to start writing things down right now. I'm going to give you names. I'm going to give you details. We're going to start writing things down. would your name appear next to the word faithfulness? Would positive things for the ministry appear next to your name? Would your name be found? Or would you, like Demas, be found faithless? As you look at Missions Month, God has something for you this month, something that he wants you to do, something he has trusted to just you. Will you be faithful in that?